Brazil has a rich and extensive history, with a population surpassing 200 million and traces of human presence that may extend back over 30,000 years. Although Brazil shares borders with nearly every other South American country and was the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery, it stands apart from its neighbors in a significant manner. It was colonized by Portugal, not Spain. But what led to this distinction? What influence did Portugal exert on Brazil? And how did Brazil evolve into the nation it is today? The initial Portuguese navigator to arrive in Brazil accomplished this feat either in the concluding years of the 15th century or precisely in the year 1500. As per Duarte Pacheco Pereira's account, he claimed to have encountered Brazil during an expedition commissioned by King Manuel of Portugal in 1498. Yet this version of events is not widely acknowledged. Instead, the commonly held belief is that the initial Portuguese voyage to reach Brazil occurred in 1500, led by a fleet under the command of Pedro Álvares Cabral. Cabral was actually en route to India, but veered significantly off course due to unexpected circumstances, eventually sighting land. This discovery prompted the fleet to make landfall at Porto Seguro, marking the beginning of Portuguese colonization in the region. Upon realizing that this newly discovered land fell within the Portuguese side of the Tordesillas line, the primary objective was to establish a settlement aimed at monopolizing trade, especially concerning the highly sought-after pau-brasil redwood trees. This naturally led to direct interaction between the Portuguese and the extensive indigenous population in the region. Initially, it is speculated that Portuguese settlers and the indigenous population may have cooperated in harvesting and trading pau-brasil. But this collaboration proved to be short-lived, as circumstances changed. As the redwoods were progressively harvested and traded, Brazil's coastline was increasingly deforested, prompting the need to venture further inland in search of pau-brasil trees. As a consequence, many colonists started exploring alternative methods of resource production for trade, including the establishment of plantations. Hence, the collaboration between the Portuguese and the natives came to an end, as the former determined that the most effective method to operate their plantations was by enslaving the latter. Consequently, numerous indigenous people perished or fled, driven by a desire to escape enslavement, succumbing to newly introduced European diseases, or eventually dying due to the harsh conditions of slavery. Even those who managed to escape were not assured of safety, as Jesuit missionaries and Portuguese bandeirantes ventured inland, thereby subjecting escaped natives to disease and, at the hands of the bandeirantes, enslavement once again. By the mid-1530s, Brazil had been partitioned into more than a dozen individual colonies, to be owned and administered by wealthy Portuguese nobles. However, with the exception of one, all these settlements were eventually relinquished to the Portuguese crown by 1549, as they had failed to achieve substantial success. Following this, a new governor-general was dispatched to oversee the territory, and a capital was founded in Salvador. However, the Portuguese were not the sole European power seeking to gain influence in Brazil. Apart from sporadic border disputes with Spain, Portugal didn't face significant concerns regarding their Iberian neighbor, thanks to the Treaty of Tordesillas signed a century earlier. This treaty unmistakably designated Brazil as part of Portugal's sphere of expansion, not Spain's. However, beyond the Iberian Peninsula and the Pope himself, who had ratified the papal decree confirming the treaty, few others recognized these boundaries. Consequently, France, England, and other colonial powers were eager to explore Brazil themselves and claim whatever land they could. The French in particular attempted to establish a foothold on the map, but were ultimately repelled by the Portuguese in the latter half of the 16th century. The Dutch also made an attempt to seize part of Brazil, but they too ultimately succumbed to the determined Portuguese. Despite successfully repelling external rivals, the Portuguese faced internal challenges within Brazil that demanded swift resolution. Confronted with an escalating demand for labor and a diminishing local population, Portugal turned to Africa to bolster its Brazilian colony. The indigenous population in Brazil had significantly declined due to disease, emigration, and the harsh labor conditions endured by those enslaved. However, simultaneously, settlers in Brazil faced a mounting need for laborers on their plantations and in other sectors. At this juncture, the Portuguese turned their gaze towards Africa. Having initiated the Atlantic slave trade in the preceding century, they now sought to transport slaves from Africa directly to Brazil rather than to Europe. This decision paved the way for the transatlantic slave trade, which would subsequently unfold with its own grim history over the centuries. However, at that moment, it served as Portugal's solution to the dwindling native population in Brazil. The Portuguese undertook this endeavor on a massive scale. Approximately 40% of African slaves transported during the transatlantic slave trade ultimately ended up in Brazil, more than 8 times the number that reached the United States. Despite the brutality of their chosen method, the Portuguese in Brazil achieved considerable success in trade and the overall development of the colony. Brazil's exploration yielded new minerals and resources that could be exported at lucrative rates. Furthermore, the Portuguese discovered additional trade markets as they expanded their offerings. By this point, Brazil was taking on the semblance of its modern form, with a diverse culture emerging and the capital relocated to Rio de Janeiro. This transition foreshadowed another era of significant transformation and progression towards the Brazil we recognize today, particularly in the early 19th century when Napoleon's actions in Europe triggered upheaval. Forced to flee their homeland due to Napoleon's actions, the Portuguese royal family sought refuge in Brazil. Their presence sparked a renewed commitment to bolstering Brazil's local economy and fostering its development, surpassing previous efforts. These initiatives helped transition Brazil from merely a tool of Portugal to a self-sustaining entity, laying the groundwork for independence. Essential infrastructure such as schools, banks, and other key establishments were constructed, additional ports were opened, and Brazil experienced a period of flourishing growth. During this period, while the royal family could finally return to Portugal, Pedro I, the son of Dom João VI, remained in Brazil to govern on behalf of Portugal. However, he harbored different aspirations. After being left to govern Brazil on behalf of Portugal, Pedro I came to the conclusion that Brazil deserved more autonomy and recognition than Portugal was willing to provide. Therefore, he made the bold decision to declare Brazil's independence. Before this decisive move, in 1815, Dom João had elevated Brazil to the status of a kingdom, albeit with Portugal still maintaining significant control. However, it wasn't until September 7, 1822, that Brazil officially declared its independence. Pedro's proclamation of Brazil's sovereignty is famously associated with his declaration, "Independence or Death," which he is said to have exclaimed from the banks of the Ipiranga River. Shortly after his declaration of Brazil's independence, Pedro was crowned as Emperor of Brazil, a title he assumed just as tensions with Portugal escalated, eventually leading to a bloody war between the two sides. The conflict between the Brazilian army and their local militia allies against the Portuguese forces persisted until the end of 1823, as both sides fought for control over the former colonies. The war, waged on both land and sea, concluded in Brazil's favor when the final Portuguese garrison surrendered, leaving the newly independent state triumphant and the Portuguese in disgrace. Following independence, Brazil faced significant internal challenges. These struggles eventually led Pedro to abdicate his throne in favor of his 5-year-old son, Pedro II. A line of regents ruled in the young boy's place until 1840. The sovereignty of the young nation faced challenges from its South American neighbors, yet Brazilian trade and immigration continued to thrive. However, Brazil's time as an empire ended shortly after the abolition of slavery by the monarchy in 1888. In 1889, the Brazilian Republic was founded, marking the beginning of the Old Republic era. In 1930, following a series of relatively moderate presidencies, Getulio Vargas seized power through a military coup and governed as a dictator until 1945. In the subsequent decades, Brazil continued to face significant challenges, although elected presidents made efforts to stimulate the country's economy and development. During the 1960s, Brazil came under military rule, which governed the nation with harsh methods until 1985, coinciding with soaring inflation and economic struggles. Despite Brazilians adopting a new constitution in 1988, inflation remained a significant obstacle until the 1990s. Despite facing deep economic and political struggles, Brazil demonstrated resilience and independence. Throughout its history, Brazil has weathered various challenges, showcasing its ability to persevere and assert its sovereignty. Without Portugal's colonization, Brazil's trajectory would have undoubtedly been different. While the moral implications of colonization are complex and contested, it's undeniable that Brazil's history as a colony and later a kingdom under Portuguese rule shaped its identity and development. With the assistance of exiled Portuguese monarchs, Brazil transitioned from a colony to a kingdom and eventually to a sovereign empire and later a republic. Brazil's abundant natural resources and flourishing trade played significant roles in establishing its prominence. Today, it stands as a distinctive nation in South America, uniquely shaped by its Portuguese colonial heritage, being the sole outcome of the Portuguese side of the Tordesillas line.